It is time once again for the Scramble Podcast in beautiful Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I am Paul Hollingsworth alongside my podcast partner, three-time Heck Crichton Award winner and Canadian Football Hall of Famer, Chris Flynn in Long Lake, Quebec. And today we are joined by Dave Poulin, former Philadelphia Flyers captain. He's a whole bunch of other things as well, but from a Flyers standpoint, we'll call him the Flyers captain as the headliner for this podcast. Dave, really grateful you took time to join us, and thanks for being with us.
My pleasure, guys. I'm looking forward to it. I'm a football fan. I went to a small college in the Midwest that has a football team, and it was a pretty good quarterback. My introduction to college football, Chris, was in 1978, and the very first game I went to, three of my buddies from Toronto came down, and they were playing against Missouri, and they had a pretty good tight end by the name of Kellen Winslow. And the quarterback on our team would go out late for the huddle. He'd kind of amble out, was kind of moving in slow motion, and he was wearing number 3. And so Joe Montana was my introduction to college football. And I thought, well, this guy's pretty good. I don't know.
That was going to be my question for you, but I'll ask you about it anyway.
Well, I'd say, and by the way, Dave, you want to, Chris, of course, has an iconic football career. And a lot of the people who are watching this podcast know Chris is a football guy. He is a diehard Philadelphia Flyers fan. And when I told him that I had texted with Dave Poulin and I said, Poul, he's going to join us for the podcast, it was as if I bought him a Cadillac. He was so excited. So he was pumped up. So Chris, I'll let you get started with this. Have at it. Your 1980s memories, your Dave Poulin fandom. Start the podcast off for us.
Sure. Yeah, Dave, I'll just mention my little home bar back here. You can see I put a few little extra things behind us. So we kind of have a tradition here when we have our hockey games out on the lake, whenever we come inside. And when someone comes in, especially someone new, we'll try to ask them to find all the Flyers logos that are in here. And there's probably about 25 or 30 of them. You can see a few on behind each of me, the Flyers clock. And my daughter, I'll give my daughter Chelsea a shout out. She gave me this Flyers hoodie. She actually lives in Drexel Hill, which is, just outside of Philadelphia. So I'm going to visit her next week. So just by chance, she moved there with her husband. All these years later. Of course, I'm a big Flyers fan. So, and before I ask you about the Flyers and Notre Dame playing and coaching there, I did have that football question for you. I knew that Joe Montana's last year was like your first year, I think, right? You just got there. And I was wondering, geez, did you ever go to watch him play some of his games? But you and you did. And wow, he was a legend even back then.
Yeah, you don't know this, but Paul sent me a list of your questions, although he didn't know what they were. I think he just knows you really well. I did, and I've had an opportunity to meet Joe a handful of times, and I had a phenomenal experience with him later in years. So his senior year, they won the national championship. The year before was my freshman year. But years later, I was an athletics director my last 2 years at Notre Dame. And on some trips with the football team, I was the number one guy. And so, I would go in early, we'd meet donors, we'd have dinners and stuff. But the very last game played in the old Stanford Stadium was I was the head guy. So I made a decision before the game, and they were playing. And if Notre Dame won, so this was Charlie Weiss, Brady Quinn, that group, Jeff Samardzija, if they won, they were going to the BCS. And it was a huge game. I think they needed help maybe from somebody else, Texas or somebody. So it was a huge game. And it was literally going to be the last game in Stanford Stadium. They had tractors that were going to dig up like right after the game as a ceremonial final game. So it's before the game, and I make a decision, I'm just going to stand on the sidelines. I can do what I want to do. I'm a big deal. And so I'm in a suit and tie, and I'm just standing on the end of the bench like this. And I sense it's kind of a little bit of a buzz, and there's two people walking towards me, and it's Joe Montana and Dwight Clark. And they've got their wives with them at that point. And so I introduced myself to Joe. I'd met him a couple of times on campus, but I reintroduced myself, and I said, our daughters are in school together. 2 of my daughters were at Notre Dame, and his daughter was as well. So we had this nice conversation. Well, I become the de facto safety net for him. And anyone approaches him in the sideline, he turns and talks to me so he doesn't have to be distracted. Now the game's going on, and it's getting better and better. Now he starts calling plays. Chris, he's and you know better than anybody, you're at field level and people don't understand how hard it is to see because of the mammoth size of everyone.
Right.
And Brady Quinn would come up the line and he just turned to me and say, it's a bubble screen. And I go, why? Like, why is it a bubble screen? He'd say, oh, the minute the strong safety drops his left foot back to me, there's no question. And fascinating to watch. So through the fourth quarter, I literally had a live play-by-play, and Joe Montana sharing some of the calls with me beforehand. So it was pretty cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, he was a football genius. Besides his athletic ability, it was his mind that did it for him, especially those last minute drives and cool Joe, as they called him. And so that's pretty cool for you to go there. And like I said, in your first year, besides, he was playing, so I thought that was pretty cool. So I had to ask you about that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a great 4 years there as a student, and then post playing in typical Notre Dame fashion, I was still playing in Washington and had just been offered another year by David Poulin, and it was the lockout year, so it was like January. And my phone rang, and it was someone from Notre Dame, and said, yeah, they're thinking of making a change in the hockey program. And basically you have to come back and coach next year. And I'm looking at the phone like, I'm not a coach. What do you mean I have to come back and coach? I'm a player. And they said, no, the program has been through some tough times because of Title IX and financing, and we really need you to come back. And I remember hanging up the phone thinking, okay, I just got a really weird phone call that's going to change my life. And it did.
Dave, I want to go back to your Notre Dame playing years. I've told people in the podcast before, from a football standpoint, I'm a Notre Dame fan. From a hockey standpoint, because where I live geographically, University of Maine and Notre Dame were the two teams I followed heavily growing up, and I still do. Every Sunday, I went to a newspaper shop in Halifax called Atlantic News, and I get the Chicago Tribune. You may remember they had a huge NCAA weekend section, and I would read all the notes about NCAA. And I knew who you were. You couldn't see you on TV back in those days, but I knew who you were. I remember the last year, I believe you led the team in scoring. You guys had a good bounce back year competitively that year from a tough year the year or two before. And so I followed you and I knew the name. I thought you were French, but I knew your last name and I knew your body of work. Yeah, it was amazing. So fast forward about a year or two later, I'm watching the Nova Scotia Voyageurs play the Maine Mariners, and I see your name bar. And so my dad, it's funny the memories you have from your childhood. We go get a V's program, we look at it, and it has a little bio next to you, Notre Dame, that's the guy. So I remember taking note of your career at an age when I was like in grade 7, grade 8, grade 9. Fast forward a year and a half later, you're in the NHL, and you're captain of the Philadelphia Flyers I think going into your second full season. Obviously, you had attributes that we didn't see. Can you go back and self-identify as to how that happened? Like, what did the Flyers see in this young player who was just starting his career, who had the juice to take over the sea from Bobby Clark for a flagship franchise, an iconic franchise in the NHL? Because in my perspective, it's an amazing part of your story.
It really is. A lot of it is right place in the right time and very, very fortuitous. I was not going to play hockey post-college. I wasn't drafted. And I was caught right in that 1979-80 20-year-old draft to an 18-year-old draft, WHA merging to the NHL. So they combined 3 draft years into one and made it 12 rounds instead, or 6 rounds instead of 12 rounds. So there were a lot of players, including Tim Kerr and Ron Flockhart from the Flyers, who were never drafted. And because of that compression of 3 years into one, and if you remember, they were all taking the 17-year-olds, Mark Napier, Kenny Linsman, Rob Ramage, who had played as 17-year-olds in WHA. So that was sort of the draft part of it. But going to Notre Dame, I had no expectations of playing pro hockey. I picked a school that I thought I could get a great education at and then move on with my life and essentially use hockey to get a great education. That was the plan and the goal, and that fell into place. And I chose Notre Dame over, you were allowed 6 recruiting trips. I picked 6 schools. I went to Notre Dame first. I called home 2 hours after I was on campus and said to my dad, I'm not even taking the other 5 trips. I'm going to Notre Dame. And he was like, wow, you promised these schools you'd come and visit. And I said, look, Dad, I'm not going to get better than this. This is so cool. And the campus is just a magical place. And then hockey, was not as prominent then as it is now at Notre Dame. We took some steps to get it there. And I went and I had a great freshman year and then got spinal meningitis my sophomore year. So it was a real setback my second and third years. Came back, had a good senior year, as you mentioned, and had some job offers or hockey offers to come in during spring break. St. Louis, Detroit, a couple teams said, come and play for our American League team. And I said, no, I'm not going to play. I've got a job for next year. I'm going to go to work. And it was Ted Sater, who went on to coach in the NHL, who was coaching in Sweden at the time. And he called me very late, like in June after graduation, and said, I'm coaching in Sweden. We've lost our import very late. Would you be interested? And I had taken a job in international sales with Procter & Gamble. And I talked to them and they said, well, we don't mind if you live in Europe for a year before you come and join us. So it was a weird twist and turn of events. I landed in Sweden and I tore up Division One, not the Elite Series, but Division One. And came back. I went to Portland, Maine on an amateur tryout offer. They were a very good team in the American League, playing for Tom McPhee. I played 16 games there and got called up to the NHL. And still on an amateur tryout offer. Got called up on April Fool's Day, guys.
Yeah.
When the phone rings on April Fool's Day, you're like, yeah, you know what? This probably isn't Keith Allen. Yeah, probably not Keith Allen. And then it was a whirlwind from there. I scored 2 goals in my first 2 shots in Maple Leaf Gardens on April 2nd. And then, that summer was when Bobby Clarke changed my life, basically. I can get into that story, but Bobby Clarke literally changed my life that summer. It was going to be his last year playing. He didn't know that at the time. And he invited me at the end of my 5 games total, 2 regular season, 3 playoff games. Through a weird set of circumstances, he invited me that summer to work out with him. I didn't know where I was going, what I was doing. I just got married a year before, graduated from college, played a year in Europe, played 16 games in Portland, Maine. I didn't know where to go. And so we made a decision to sublet from another Flyer who was going home for the summer. And all of a sudden I was working out with a legend and, 6 days a week. And from a training standpoint, so far ahead of his time as a full-blown type 1 diabetic. And he was training 6 days a week, split body parts, full lifting sessions, run 5 miles Monday through Friday, run 8 miles on Saturday mornings.
Which most of the guys did not do back then, right?
Not a chance.
In the summertime?
Not a chance.
No.
Even for him to invite me, Chris, was, and you think back, like, what does he see in me through 5 games? I don't, if we said 10 words to each other during that time. But, as I got older, I thought, it was an interesting move by him. No one would train with him in the summer. And
they couldn't keep up. He
saw someone. Well, they didn't want to get up. He did it at 7 a.m, 6 days a week. Guys didn't want to get up at 7 a.m, 6 days a week. And I remember after about a month of training, and I had a good base at Notre Dame. I had worked out with their football team actually one summer and had a good base of strength and conditioning. But I remember saying to him about maybe even halfway through that first summer, like, who else is doing this? And he looked at me and he said, nobody. He said, you will be the best conditioned player on the team this year if you keep doing this. And so what an incentive for me to go into training camp. He was 36 at the time, I believe. So I was a 24-year-old version of a 36-year-old maniac in the weight room.
Did you have leadership abilities in you, going back to how your parents raised you, that maybe came to the forefront at Notre Dame? I know it may be difficult for you to talk about yourself this way, but you didn't become captain by accident. Obviously, there's some gravitas to what you brought to the equation as a 24, 25-year-old.
Yeah, and it was Bob Clarke. They made the decision. It wasn't the new coach, Mike Keenan, who wouldn't even know me, right? He had coached in Rochester in the American League and then had gone back to the University of Toronto basically to break his contract with Buffalo, I believe. And then, so Clarkey hired a sort of an unknown, unproven coach. And he had retired unexpectedly. In fact, he had come to me and said, I'm going to announce my retirement. And we were on a trip together. And so here's a rookie on a trip with a legend. And he calls me down to the dock the first day and said, yeah, when we get back, I'm going to announce my retirement. I'm like, seriously? And he said, yeah, I'm going to be the new general manager and vice president. And I'm like, great, and I'm a player, and I'm on a trip with you right now. It was quite an interesting 10 or 12 days, but we were very, very close. He had done everything for me as a player. We had roomed together, and he had mentored me tremendously. So that was part of it, Paul. I had been a captain pretty much every team I played for, but when you're a kid, the captain's generally the best player. Right? He's not, it's not leadership ability. I was a captain at Notre Dame for 2 years. And I did take a great deal of pride in it. But from a standpoint of, I was one of 6 guys. We hung out all the time, five of us, 6 of us that hung out all the time. We still stay in close touch. And I wasn't the prominent leader in that group. I mean, we were all, sort of it's an interesting group to look back on because it's one of the top fighter pilots in the history of Canada is one of us, and a business leader who has done amazing things. And so it's an interesting eclectic group of guys. Another guy was the president of a steel company, and an interesting fivesome to align with no direction whatsoever through high school, by the way, that led to those respective success stories. Other than the pilot who always knew what he was going to do. And when the opportunity came, I don't know, I think what really changed it for me was Notre Dame. It's a small school, there's 8,000 kids there. And you're in classes with 13 kids, 12 kids, and you have to be a part of it. And by the way, guys, I was absolutely stunned at the amount of work kids were doing when I got there my freshman year. I was looking at them like, you do this every night? Are you kidding me? Like, I'm not sure I'd opened a book in high school. And, and they were doing this every single night. And so it taught me to learn in a different way. It taught me interest levels in different way. So if you're going to say what one aspect of your leadership, I went on to be captain. Actually, I wore a letter for the 3 teams I played for in the National League. What aspect of it changed you more than anything? It was the University of Notre Dame.
Isn't that something?
That's awesome.
I find it really interesting. And you look at it through the contemporary lens, I would imagine, and we'll get into your broadcasting career in a moment, but as your work through TSN as an analyst and a broadcaster for the Montreal Canadiens television games, you must look at Brady Tkachuk, Nick Suzuki, young captains like that, and you may or may not see a little piece of Dave Poulin in them, but you probably find their circumstance to be very relatable based on your own career.
Yeah, and the kids you're talking about have such tremendous talent. That's what got them there. The person I would arguably align with, and I'm going to flatter myself by saying this because he's an absolute Hall of Famer, career-wise, is Patrice Bergeron. And, who didn't come in as heralded from a hockey standpoint as the other kids that you're mentioning. And I was always hesitant. And Chris, this is interesting because, it's a little bit different in football, I know, but I was hesitant when they were naming young captains, Connor McDavid at 19 or 20. But it wasn't the question of their leadership. It was the question of what they would have to deal with off the ice as a captain.
Exactly, yeah.
Because you think of all the different challenges you have in a locker room that have nothing to do with football or hockey, that have to do with life and the different things kids go through. I didn't want Connor McDavid to have to deal with some of that stuff at 19 or 20 years old. I didn't know whether he was equipped to deal with it off the ice. I knew he was equipped to be a player on the ice. But I think they're getting these kids a lot more help off the ice than arguably I would have had at that point.
I got to mention too, when you became a captain, even though it was your second year, you mentioned Notre Dame and playing in Europe for a year. So you were like 23, 24, yes. 24 when you became a captain. And I got to ask you, for a lot of my Flyers friends, like in that first year or two, you were playing, you mentioned Bobby Clark, Bill Barber, Rick McLeish, the Broad Street bully guys that from the Stanley Cup era. And those guys were kind of at the end of their career. Yet your group of guys, once you became captain, once Bobby Clark retired, those next couple of years, like that 85 team, that very young Flyers 85 team going all the way to the Stanley Cup final, and just your style of play was like, these guys were really fast, talented players. Like how did that evolve just your style of play with that group of young guys? Like, how did that like compare to the Flyers teams from the 70s? It wasn't just the Flyers, the whole league had changed by the 80s, but how did that evolve those first few years with the Flyers, and you guys became such an excellent team, like, right away in your first couple of years there?
Well, I'm going to give the credit to Bob Clark, who knew that a drastic change was necessary in the organization. It wasn't just, change that was necessary, like a couple of new players, But the strange part about saying that, he knew he had to remove himself as a player to initiate the change. Like, think about that, because he had lots of game left, but he was willing. And Bob Clark loved playing the game of hockey. And I think back now to the single toughest decision he ever made as a general manager, and that was to become one, to step back from playing. And that's a big step. And I think this is his affiliation, his respect for his bond with Ed Snyder that did that. I think Mr. Snyder knew that it would take something seismic to change the organization at that time. And the seismic piece was Bob Clark removing himself as a player. He was too strong in the locker room for any of that change to occur had he been in that locker room. Just, it wouldn't have happened. And essentially, him turning the reins over, even to a second-year player, and all of a sudden this influx of youth, Rick Tocchet at 20 years old, Derek Smith and Peter Zezel at 19, the Sutter twins at 20, Murray Craven might have still been 20, might have been 21. Like, think of those ages. All kids. And so I was, I don't want to say, it was a bunch of really young kids shaping each other. Now, we did have a couple of a little bit older guys in Mark Howe, who was tremendous, but they also had to give up a piece. You think of Brad March had already been a captain in Atlanta. Mark Howe, Brad McCrimmon, who was pretty established, even though around the same age. And they had to be able to relinquish to me as well as leader. And that wasn't always smooth, guys. That was a little, I wasn't exactly, when I first came in, I wasn't, I wasn't exactly accepted as what I grew to be, because that was a significant change.
I look back at those teams, those Flyers teams in the 1980s. I look back at a lot of teams in the 1980s. The Winnipeg Jets, playing in the Smythe division, couldn't get out of the division because it was so good. Hindsight kind of tells us that the Flyers became really good at an inconvenient time because the Islanders and the Oilers were winning a lot of cups. In hindsight, does it frustrate you? Is it a lament? Because that team you should have a ring or two based on how good that team was, but you got there, but just didn't quite get over the hump.
It would have been 87 for me, not 85. In 85, we weren't ready. We were banged up. I think Brad McCrimmon was out at that point, who was too important of a player to be without. But 87 would have been the team, and Tim Kerr was hurt. So we were without one of the best goal scorers in the National Hockey League for that entire series. But it was funny because I would have these philosophical thoughts as a coach, in later years as a manager. In that 84, 85 team, I was the number one center. Well, the number two center on the other team wore number 11. The number one center wore number 99. So if I was number one on our team, I was smart enough to know we're not good enough. I'm saying that, it's just realistic, right? We're not good enough. If I'm the number one center and Messier is their number two center, it just doesn't add up. But in 87, with Hextall in net, we lost Pelle Lindbergh at that point. And so both times we were there, we had the best goalie in the league, and the other guy was Grant Fuhr, who was pretty darn good. But Hexie that year in 87 gave us a chance, and he did. And we were young, brash, but we'd had the confidence. We'd been through things together. Think about going through the Lindbergh situation in 85 together and growing with that. That made us incredibly tight, guys. That just took us to a different level of bonding that you would never wish to happen, but when it does happen, it's realistic that it takes you to a different level of friendship and understanding and bonding experience.
I remember that 87 final, Dave. Of course, I'm sure you remember it too. I remember before game 5, Edmonton, or getting the parade organized because they were going to beat you guys in 5 again, but that didn't happen. You guys won. You went back to Philadelphia, won game 6 with that big JJ Dagno goal, and then game 7, which you had to wait an extra day to play. I remember, you guys got the lead 1-0. Then they went up 2-1. I remember there was a few times you guys had a chance to tie it, 2-2 in game 7. And then I think it was Anderson maybe that scored to make it 3-1, but like that close against a legendary team, like just shows how good the Flyers were to, and that was one of the first Stanley Cup final game 7s in, I think at that time it was in like 20 years or something like that. Right. So it was a memorable series, which I'm sure you remember very well yourself.
Yeah, it really was. And it was Ilka Sinisalo that had the breakaway on Fear, and he rattled it between his pads. And Ilka was such a great goal scorer. Another guy we lost far too early, by the way, Sinisalo. But that was the big opportunity. We had a chance to go up 2-0 early in the game as well. You think of who scored their goals at that point. Messi got the first one from Kent Nielsen, an ultra-talented guy. And then Curry got the second one from Gretzky, and then Anderson the third. So it was their ultra stars and their Hall of Famers that beat us. But in terms of a team, I didn't win a Stanley Cup. And back there's like 3 Prince of Wales trophies. There's no Stanley Cup on the shelf back there. Yeah. And it changes. It doesn't change you, but it changes the perception of you. You're not introduced as a Stanley Cup winner. And yet, for those teams, the teams I played on, Boston in 1990, to get there 3 times was a tremendous accomplishment. I went to the Final Four 6 times. And then you'll see somebody, come in, and I think I point to Ron Hainsey when he won his first cup. He was in his 30s in Pittsburgh, and he won the cup. He had never played a playoff game, guys. Amazing. Before that year. He'd never played a playoff game. His first year in the playoffs, as a 30-something-year-old, he wins the Stanley Cup. And it was funny because we were at a golf tournament on the East Coast, and it was the year that Raymond won his cup in Colorado. And we were at a big charity golf tournament in Cape Cod, and we were sitting at the bar, and they put a graphic up, and it was most Stanley Cup playoff games without winning a cup. And Ray was number 1. And so if he won a cup, he was going off the list. And I remember looking up at the list, and I started to laugh because, I think it was number 3, number 5, and number 8 were sitting at the bar. And I remember toasting and saying, "Gentlemen, if Ray wins his cup, we're moving up the list."
That is amazing. That is amazing. Hey, Dave, I wanted to ask you about Pelle Lindbergh. You and I talked about this a couple of times off camera at TSN. In my childhood, 2 people I think about a lot. Thurman Munson and Pelle Lindbergh, 2 amazing athletes, incredible human beings that we lost too young. I know he was a friend of yours. He was a celebrated teammate. You touched on it a second ago. To go through something like that as a person, as a leader, and as a teammate, what kind of effect does that still have on you today? Can you kind of put that experience and that loss into the proper prism at this stage of your life?
It does still have an impact on me to this day. And there are days when he just pops up in your mind somehow. And there was one earlier this morning, and it's usually somebody posts something, or there was a picture of he and Bob Froese on the ice and I don't even know why. It just flashed across my screen at some point early this morning. But he was such a unique individual. He was 26 years old when the accident happened. And I was out with him. We were all out that night. And that night we had won our 10th or 11th game in a row. He had not played that night. And, he loved his toys, and he had a car that went way too fast that he brought over from Europe. It was a Porsche. And, I don't even think it was legal in the US and in terms of exactly what, it had available in terms of horsepower and everything else. And he drove too fast, and he was drinking clearly. And we left the bar together. It was an after hours bar, and we left the bar together in the early morning hours. I went one way and he went the other way. And, I got a call a short time later from 2 people who had followed him in their car and seen the accident had tracked back to a player they knew on our team, and the player had called me and said, we got to do something here. And so I immediately called Clarkie, who was out of town, and then called Mike Keenan. This is 6:30 in the morning. And Keenan and I went to the hospital and identified him. And it was, talk about moments that change your life, and moments that, from a drinking and driving standpoint, that changed every consideration of that I would ever have. It became a reminder to me that you can learn from other people's mistakes, and it was a mistake. And, but from a standpoint of a player, he was such a special player. And you talk about how young that first team was in 84, 85. He taught us how to win, guys. Like, he taught us how to win. We thought we were really good. We'd win 1-0, we'd be strutting out of the rink. We had no business winning the game. We just happened to have the best goalie. But he did live his life. And I've shared a story with others about him. He wanted a boat. And this probably describes Pele better than anybody. And, with where Stockholm is, if you have a boat in the summer, it's almost like having a car with the islands and the waters. Yeah. And when he bought his first boat, he got on it. And I got this story from a good friend of his over there. And it was after the fact. And he got on the boat, and he was with the boat sales guy, and he bought it. He was all excited, and they painted the name on it in the back and everything. And the guy handed him the keys, and I was like, what do I do now? And the guy said, you don't know how to drive a boat? And he said, no idea. It was like a 36-footer or something.
Like a yacht?
Park. Yeah, exactly, the marina. And but that's the way he lived. He lived large.
It's just amazing. And maybe we'll use that as a pivot point to your coaching career. As I could hear the empathy in your voice, Dave, as you talked about that experience, as you ended your career and became a head coach at the NCAA level, helping manage and nurture the lives of young men. You became a sports, obviously through sports administration, you had a high role with the Toronto Maple Leafs as well, athletic director at Notre Dame. Does an experience like that stay with you when it comes to looking over, watching over, and mentoring some younger people in your life?
Always. Absolutely always, Paul. It never leaves you. The number of times that I would, and you'd have to almost pick your time so it didn't soften the impact of it, but I'd share the story with my teams when I coached at Notre Dame, and just about that, you're allowed to learn from other people's. And drinking and driving was a no-go. I mean, it was just a non-factor for me from that point forward. But think about it, and then you have 3 teenage daughters at the same time, and you're teaching them driving, and you're also sharing the story and saying, okay, by the way, here's one option that's not on the table ever, and that's consuming alcohol and getting behind the wheel of a car. And so I think the impact of that story, the power of it to me, it changed my life in a lot of ways. It simply did. It also gave me an appreciation for what I had and what I was experiencing. We're the same age, same birth year. And, and not that I took things for granted. I was an undrafted free agent, was the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers, but you're on a pretty good roll at that point. And you're thinking life is pretty good and you're pretty invincible. And it has a humbling nature when something like that happens. And Clarkie called me in, and it would have been Tuesday. The accident was Sunday morning, it would have been Tuesday, and they were having the funeral on Wednesday. And he called me in late afternoon, and he said, you have to do the eulogy tomorrow. And I remember looking at him going, what do you mean? And he said, well, you have to eulogize Pele. And I said, what is it? I don't even know what that means. I'd never experienced death of any sort. And, as we were going through it with a young team like that, like most people had both or all 4 of their grandparents still. Like nobody had experienced death of any sort. And so I sat down. I still have this little table in my house now, this little antique table. And I sat down, and it was, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 o'clock at night, knowing that I had to write a eulogy for my departed teammate. And guys, I looked up at that clock. I think it was 1:30 in the morning. There wasn't one single word on that paper. And it was a yellow pad and a pen. I was like, I can't do this. How am I going to do this? And I picked up the pen and just started to write, and then wrote the whole thing out, like right through. And I have it. I have it in my possession on the same paper. handwritten, and then the next day doing it in a jam-packed little Swedish church in Philadelphia, 300 plus people jammed into the church, including your whole team. And all I knew was that I could not look up from that paper at any of my teammates when I was doing that. Not a chance. Not a chance.
No,
it was the impact it has. It changes your life.
For sure.
Yeah, without question. It is such a tough story. And I mean, to talk about it, it's part of, when I think of Dave Poulin, I think of those 80s Flyers teams, and I think of the Pelly Lingberg chapter. So we appreciate you sharing that with us. When you got to Notre Dame, after you were there for about a decade, Brian Berkey, my favorite person to interview, pulls you away to become, I believe, vice president was your title with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Before you became a broadcaster, did you see yourself being like a general manager or president of the team someday? Was that what did that track of your career look like at that stage for you?
You know, there was no hard plans, even when I was playing. When I played, Berkey was my agent for 5 years. And from that Portland team right through my first 5 years. So after 2 years of playing, he calls me and he says, okay, you're either going to school, you get an MBA or a law degree, or you're going to work this summer. And I remember saying, Berkey, I've got a job. I'm the captain of the Philadelphia Flyers. I just went to Stanley Cup Finals. Like, forget it. And he said, the average career is 4.2 years. You're halfway done. Wait a second, you're my agent? You work for me? And so that started me on a track. And so I worked for the better part of 6 summers. And I interviewed with a whole bunch of companies in the summer of '85 and ended up aligning with a couple of guys on Wall Street. And so I worked for a big brokerage firm for 3 years, got all my licenses, and then we opened a little broker dealer. So when I got traded to Boston, I was a managing partner in the broker dealer. I was always going to do something else. You know, I wasn't going to coach. I wasn't going to be a manager, Paul. I wasn't. It wasn't what I saw myself doing. And I'm glad I tried that when I did, because it wasn't for me. I wasn't, I was a Wall Street guy, but I wasn't a Wall Street guy. And so when the opportunity came up at Notre Dame, that opportunity was more about raising my children in one place. And I knew that if I went on the pro side, that the chances of staying in one place for the twins were 9 and my youngest was 5 at that point. So, I was looking at 10 to 12 years. Where could I go in pro game that would guarantee me 10 to 12 years? There's no such thing. No. And so that was the move to Notre Dame. That was the impetus behind that. And then coming out of Notre Dame, 10 years as a coach, 2 years as an assistant athletics director. I moved into private industry for a couple of years in Chicago, and had actually a cool little gig going in the search business, in executive search, and did some really cool searches and, a lot of work with CFOs and different firms. And when Berkey got the Toronto job, we had always stayed in close touch, and he visited Notre Dame in the summers with his kids and put them in the sports camps, and we had stayed very close. And I remember, I had scouted for him part-time when he was in Anaheim. So I actually have a cup ring from 2007. Oh, wow. And but it wasn't, really going that direction. And when he got the job, I was watching a game. I was in Chicago, and I lived right downtown in Chicago, and I was in the middle of a huge search. And I remember watching TV one night, and he was sitting in the press box in Toronto. So he had taken the job in, I believe, November of 2008. And watching him at work. And I picked up the phone the next morning and called him and said, I want to come and work with you. And I remember him saying, oh, you're doing great in the search industry, and you're killing it in the search industry. You're doing really well. You don't want to get into this. And I said, no, Berkey, I want to. And that was on a Monday morning. And he called me back later Monday and he said, okay, I'm coming to Chicago on Thursday morning. I'm going to fly into O'Hare. There's a Hilton hotel right at the airport, and I want to chat with you that morning. He was coming in on some other business. He said, so can you meet me at the airport hotel at 7 a.m.? I'm coming in late Wednesday night, and I'll meet you Thursday morning. And then as Berkey tells it, and then he says, then you show up. He says, you got a suit on, you got a resume, you got a 5-year plan. You're like, oh, come on. And so but he didn't know where I fit, and he said, here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking director of post scouting and another management guy. And I said, well, I think I'm the management guy. And called me back maybe the next morning and said, okay, you're in. And I was vice president of hockey operations for 5 years. And unfortunately, Berkey was only there 2.5 of them. And then Dave Nonis took over. And that was the lockout year. And then when Brendan Shanahan came in, he was changing everybody out. And that was 2014.
And that brings you to the broadcasting side of it. Did you ever see yourself as being a broadcaster?
No, I really didn't, Paul. When that was the summer of change in the NHL, that was the summer that the Sportsnet got the big deal, and the rights all changed, and it was 2014. And when this happened, and Claude Loiselle and I were fired in late July, so most of the jobs for next year are done, and so I didn't know, I didn't know what I was going to do, and one of the producers from Sportsnet reached out right away because they just had these rights. And they had to hire people. And I was on my way in to have lunch with him, and the phone rang. I was outside on the street, and it was a general manager, and he said, come to work for me. And it was a city I really liked and a team that was good. He said, come to work for me. And I said, well, you know what? I honestly, this is all, I'm buzzing. I don't know what I'm going to do. I need to step back and look at the situation. And he said, well, you have a job here. You can start tomorrow. You can start in a week. You can start in whatever you want to do. And then I got a couple of other posts. Then I walked in and sat down with this producer, and I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I just got a call out on the sidewalk that I took, and I'm going to follow up with that. And then a couple of other teams did call and reach out. And then it was actually me that reached out to an old friend from high school, and that was Steve Dryden. I had known the famous quiz master, Chris. The quiz master.
I was going to say the quiz master. I love it. Yeah. Master.
And he said, "Look, we don't have regional deals. We don't. He said, basically, I have no work for you, nothing." He said, "I'd like to hire you, but I have absolutely nothing for you." And I said, "So one place is telling me we have all the opportunity in the world, and the other place is telling me we have nothing." So of course, Chris, what do? You take the job where the guy goes, "We got nothing for you. We got no seats. We got no rooms for you." And that's what I did. I really did. I got a real good feel I met a couple of people. I knew a couple of people there, and I met a couple of people, and they just said, well, I had a sense they're going to figure something out. And so the first show they put me on was TH2N with Glenn Sheeler. That's Hockey Tonight, the late night show. And, I sat down with a couple of the great directors there that really helped me, and producers. And then a couple of things happened, and opportunities opened up, and I kind of slid sideways a little bit, and kind of imposed myself, and ended up in a great seat at TSN, and love everything I do. And the beauty of it is living in the different silos, because I do, 6 or 7 very different things from each other. Yeah. And I really like the diversity of that.
Chris and I are going to get you on some rapid fire with the Canadian teams going into the playoffs, but I want to wrap up the broadcasting part of your career in a bit of a bow. Just as a background, Dave and I did a couple of post-game breakdowns in the Sports Center studio, I guess, Dave, just before the pandemic, 2018, 2019. And we're supposed to look very conversational and ad-lib-ish and make like we know what we're talking about. But to me, I'm memorizing stuff, and I'm trying to be fluid with my thoughts. And I look over, and you have these handwritten notes, and the level of preparation you had, to my eye, was almost encyclopedic. That gave me a look under the hood at how it was almost like you were scouting a game when it came to the notes you brought into the studio. And you may even forget the circumstance when I was with you that night, but you have a thoroughness to your work that shines through. Would you self-describe that way?
I appreciate that. I'm going to go back to college as well. If I wasn't sitting in the front row, I was in trouble at that school. And it was about preparation for me. It was about doing homework. And, if I'm telling kids now about, when I work with some elite play-by-play guys, as you know, and the amount of work and preparation they do, and even the guys that have been there a long time. So, Chris, I got my 4 different colors highlighters, and I got my pink and my yellow and my orange and my green. And the books that I do, like 3 times a year, I do a book, and I did one before the trade deadline of but I do it in a way that makes sense to me. And the handwritten part is interesting because, we live in a world of computers and typing, and I handwrite to this day. And because if I write it down, then I remember it. And I generally don't have to look at the notes. But one of the most talented people in our industry, and you know him well, that's James Duffy.
Yeah.
He handwrites everything. He does.
Yeah.
I sit beside him. And then he leans over to me, Chris, halfway through, and he goes, "What does this say?" And I go, "It's in your writing."
His own writing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you guys are a good. You're a good team together too. You guys on the set too. So that shows as well.
Well, we have fun. I mean, we do, and we push each other, and we have fun, and it is a mix. The person that put Jeff O'Neill and I together knew that we were 180s from each other. I mean, we were the opposite as players. He was 5th overall. I was undrafted free agent. He was an offensive talent. I was a defensive forward. I mean, everything about us was very, very different. And yet that person knew that that's what he wanted. He wanted, that contrast. And Jeff and I found a really interesting way to look at things in our respective ways and come somewhere in the middle and come up with a storyline.
Before we wrap this up, let's do a bit of rapid fire with some of the Canadian teams. Chris, we'll start with you in your neck of the woods. The Ottawa Senators, a team you follow closely from a geographic standpoint, heading into the playoffs. They are in a bit of a roll.
So I'm about 40 minutes from Ottawa. So a lot of my buddies are Sens fans. I think they're 5 and 6 points behind the Islanders and Pittsburgh, but they're also battling with, is it Washington, Florida, Buffalo, trying to get that last playoff spot. I know it's a long shot, but they're playing well. They had a very rough game the other night, right, against Chicago, but otherwise they're doing really well. So yeah, just for my Sens fans, buddy, just wanted your quick thoughts on the Senators and how they're doing, and if they still have a somewhat of a chance to try to get that last wild card spot.
I was in Chicago on Monday night, so when it was a tough game, I can ascribe to that firsthand. They do have a shot, for sure. They got tough news yesterday that Cam Talbot is going to be out for 3 weeks, so they're going to be going with 2 kids in net, Matt Sogard, a pair of 22-year-olds. And we did Kevin Mandelazi's first game. Gord Miller and I did on the island, so there's a little attachment there. But a pair of 22-year-old goalies is pretty hard to run into it. But here's the good news, Chris. We're talking about them, and it's mid-March.
Yeah.
And you're asking a very legitimate question. Are they still involved? So the fact that you're asking that question is part of the conversation. They've built the team extremely well from a cost containment standpoint moving forward. They're in great shape with the cap. They have their guys lined up. They're going to have some decisions to make, but I love the makeup of their team. The Jeff Chikrin, of course, I played with. The Jacob Chikrin addition adds just another piece to the back end. You've got Thomas Chabot, and you've got Jake Sanderson there. I really like the direction they're going in. When it gets to this stage, you always want it faster and you want more as a fan, and yet really appreciate that. I think when they do get there, that they're going to be ready. So they may get there this year, but they're not ready to win a cup this year, I don't think. But I do think there is a day in the foreseeable future when we'll be having that conversation, because this is the foundation of it. And I love the foundation. I really do. And, some of the additions they've made, Alex DeBrincat, they'll have to make a decision on, and I would work hard to bring him back. Claude Giroux, just tremendous.
Yep.
Tremendous.
Flyer.
Yeah. I mean,
a great leader. Yeah.
Terrific. But think about Brady Tkachuk being able to go to Claude Giroux and ask a question. Did you have this happen? How would you deal with this? And Claude Giroux to be able to direct him like that from a very safe seat. So that addition, I think, has meant a lot to the leadership of Brady Tkachuk. But they've got components as well. They've got players that are different from each other, that do different things. And being in Chicago on Monday, I dared to make the comparison with a Chicago writer that I know well, and about Timmy Stützle and Brady Tkachuk. Think about them, the types of players they are. And 2 players, I lived in Chicago when Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane came into the NHL. So the Kane Stützle comparison is the talented, free spirit, gunslinging offensive wizard, and the more mature leadership, of Brady Tkachuk and Jonathan Taves, as complementary players. So if we can make that comparison in a few years from now, we're having similar conversations, then the Ottawa Senators are in pretty good shape.
Awesome.
Really interesting. Let's go up the highway to Montreal, a team you know very well. You're part of the broadcast crew on a regular basis. It's a weird team. 19 months ago, they were in the Stanley Cup final. They finished 32nd last year. And I would submit to you that they're fairly prospect rich. Young defensemen at the NHL level. Lane Hutson's coming. Logan Mayu's coming. They have a couple of first-round draft picks this year. Doc, Suzuki, Caulfield, etc. Where are they in this rebuild, and how much patience should their fans deploy going forward over the next 2 or 3 years?
I think they should have a lot of patience, and I think they absolutely have a plan. I believe Jeff Gorton and Kent Hughes have a plan, and I have been remarkably impressed with Martin St. Louis as a head coach. I mean, here's a guy who's coaching midgets. And Chris, have you ever coached?
Yeah, just coached at football a little bit, played hockey, didn't coach in hockey, but yes, I did coach a little bit in high school and university. Yeah.
So did you think you were a coach?
Kind of like yourself. At the end of my playing days, no, I didn't think, and even when I did coach a bit, I felt like I didn't have the patience or whatever. It was like, it's not the same as playing, right? So it's a different mindset. It's not for everyone, but you're right. Martin St. Louis seemed like, I don't know if he thought he was going to be a coach after his playing days, but it seemed like it was a natural fit for him, for sure.
When I watch him and when I talk to him, he's a coach. I don't think I ever was. Now I say that I did it for 10 years at the Division I level, but I don't think I was wired like that. And there's a certain wiring involved in coaching, and he has it, flat out has it. And don't underestimate what Stéphane Robidas is doing with the defenseman either. Like, I think he's taken a young group of defense. He hasn't coached at the NHL level before. So I like their plan. I like their direction. I like some of their pieces. Would Connor Bedard look good in the Montreal uniform? Yeah,
probably.
He might look okay in that uniform. And they may have 2 shots at him. Who knows? With Florida's draft pick and their own. But they're clearly going in the right direction. They do have a nice prospect pool coming. Young Owen Beck is going to be a good player. They've got some kids coming. The Machar kid that they took in the first round last year. And, of course, Lefkowski, I think, is going to be just fine.
Let's go out west. Rick Bowness's Winnipeg Jets. In this city and in this household, any team that Rick Bowness is coaching is a lot of people's second favorite team. He's that well thought of in this city, in this province. I'm a huge fan on a personal level, and I want him to win so badly, Dave. I could taste it for him. But I'm worried about the Jets. You said before the podcast you're not as worried as I am.
I think they're going to be okay. I do. And, I've thought I've covered the team closely, and I've done a number of their games. And the year that they went to the conference finals, and lost to Vegas, we were out there the whole time, and so saw them firsthand. And you kept waiting for them to come back. Well, they lost 4 defensemen that same year with Bufflin, Trouba, Meyer, and Sherrod all going, which you can't. I mean, who can absorb that? Well, they did. And I still like their pieces and their components. I like the Niederreiter ad. Pierre-Luc Dubois is out of the lineup right now. He's a huge factor in this mix. I think there's enough there. They have one of the best goaltenders in the league. He's had a little setback right now. I want the setback with 20 games to go. I don't want it with 5 games to go. So I think it's coming at a time when the recovery is still very, very doable. And that's what I would say. I think they're still going to be a factor in the Central Conference. And I think they will be there, and they're going to be a tough out in the playoffs, I believe.
And the last team we'll touch on before I let Chris wrap up the podcast and bring it back to your beloved Philadelphia Flyers. Heading into the playoffs, the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't have a rooting interest in this at all from a Leaf standpoint, from a Tampa Bay standpoint. If I had to bet $10 today, I'd probably pick Tampa Bay. Is this the year? It's hard to predict. I realize that I asked this question. But how confident are you that this is the year the Leafs finally punch their ticket to at least the second round of the playoffs?
It's going to be tough.
Yeah,
it's going to be very tough. And I am working on a column for Sunday's paper, and I think the title of my column, which, by the way, this whole writing thing is a constant challenge for me.
Yeah.
But I think the title of my column is, wait a second, there's still 20 games left. You know, I think that's what it is, because we go through the trade deadline and we think that that's going to, you know, well, the Leafs got 6 new players. They're going to be great, but there's a lot of things to be worked out. And if you were betting $10 on the series, $9.75 may be on number 88 in Tampa Bay.
Yeah.
And they've got one of the best. That's the hard part of this equation. And certainly they have complementary superstars at each position. They have the defenseman in Hedman. They have the forwards, you know, the triple forwards in Point, in Stamkos and Kucherov. But Vasilevsky is the separator, guys. Just as I mentioned my confidence in Winnipeg, a lot of it lies in Connor Hellebuyck. Well, if you're going to pick a guy, and his closeout rate in Game 7s was so ludicrous.
Yeah.
I mean, just ridiculous how good he is. Well, that's in the psyche of everybody going in. And when you play a goaltender like that, and I played with some really good goaltenders, you think you have to make a perfect shot to beat him. Now you're missing the net. Now you're, you know, you've got to be perfect to beat a guy like that. Like a bad day's a red light. It's not losing a game. It's like, you know, we're going to win tonight. We're playing. I don't know. Come on.
Yeah.
And so the Leafs are, I like each one of the moves individually. 6 is a lot of players to change.
Yeah.
And it could come down to who is tending their net, looking down at number 88. And we can't sit here today and say who's going to be in net for Toronto at that point. We don't know if it'll be Matt Murray or Ilya Samsonov. We just don't. And that will be the largest single question to me in this. They won't be there. I think they will. The biggest question will be, you know, who does what between the posts.
Before we wrap up, Chris, we'll bring it back to you, and we'll bring it back to your Flyer fandom. Chris is one of the biggest Philadelphia Flyers fans I know, and I'm not trying to embarrass him, but Dave Poulin and Bobby Clark are his 2 favorite Flyers all time. So, Chris, I'll let you bring it back to Dave from a Flyer standpoint. And I'm guessing as we wrap this up, Dave, that you are once a Flyer, always a Flyer. I sense that's one of those teams that you keep a close affinity to, like a lot of the stars from that team have as well over the years.
You almost don't have a choice with the Flyers. Yeah. You'll say that you'll see somebody in the press box and you know, be talking to somebody who's in a capacity with another team, and somebody walk by and say, "Oh, the old Flyers are at it again." And it's an association, and it was the uniqueness of Mr. Snyder, and who was the owner for almost 50 years, and it was the continuity that he brought. And I remember sitting at his funeral and wondering if it would be the same that he's gone. It's not the same, guys. It's just not. You can't continue like that. And he was such an important piece of it, just as Bob Clark was and is to this day. I mean, you think about it. I talk about Mr. Snyder's longevity. Bob Clark joined in 1969.
Amazing.
It's crazy. It's crazy to think of that run that he has had, you know, plus 50 years with his association with the Flyers. And by the way, Bob Clark worked for a couple of other teams. Nobody knows that, right? He's a Flyer. And just like I played for a couple of other teams, I'm a Flyer. And it's a proud association, and they're struggling right now. And, you know, I think from all of our standpoints, you want to see it get better and you want to see it change, and you're hoping that it's just a down part of a cycle. But he was a differentiator in that Mr. Snyder was the Philadelphia Flyers. And, you know, you can't compensate for losing an important piece like that. And you just have to reconfigure and redo it. And I think they will be able to do that moving forward.
And Chris, I guess from your perspective, for a team you cheered for, there's almost an abrasion. You're frustrated with the team, how they're doing now, but you celebrate the rich history, which Dave was a part of. So it allows you to sort of look at it from a long view prism of history that goes over decades and decades, not just in the now.
Before I became a Flyers fan in the 70s when they won those, you know, those Stanley Cups, and then 1980, they actually lost to teams that went on to become Stanley Cup champions for multi-years. They lost to Montreal in 76. They went on to win 4 cups. They lost to the Islanders in 80, who went on to win 4 cups. They lost to the Oilers in 85, who won 4 cups. Lost to the Detroit 97, who went on to win multiple cups. lost to the Blackhawks in 2010, went on to win multiple cups. I remember these things. And the last few years, it's been a challenge. But I guess my quick question to you is just, how's it look for you for the next couple of years? Do you think how they might be doing?
Well, I think it's a hard look right now. It really is. And it has to start, it's not going to be a quick fix. It's simply not. And you need the talent. And if you think about the teams that have won the cup, the only team, and you could argue this, that's won a cup without a standalone superstar is arguably the St. Louis Blues guys. You could argue that, Pietrangelo was a Norris type of defenseman, but that might be the only team that's won a cup without standalone superstars. And you need standalone superstars. You simply do. I don't believe the Flyers have them right now, and I don't believe they have them coming in their system. And so you kind of have to get fortunate with it. But, everybody else that's won, and you think of Colorado, has a couple of them,
True.
Just, that have done it in a different manner.
Well, we are going to wrap it up there. Dave Poulin, former Philadelphia Flyers captain, longtime head coach of the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, and an excellent TSN broadcaster, a personal friend, and now you're a friend of the show, which is a highfalutin term. So, Dave, thank you for joining Chris and I on this broadcast. We're really, really happy you joined us.
My pleasure, guys. Pleasure to be a part of it. It's been fun.
That is another edition of the Scramble Podcast. For Chris Flynn, I am Paul Hollingsworth. We thank Dave Poulin for joining us, and we will see you next time.